All right. So before I get going, I have two things that I'd like to say. One is um, this video isn't going to have a bunch of fancy editing. I'm going to be answering a really, really good question, kind of on the fly. This video is not going to have any fancy editing. Not going to be clipping out all the mistakes and everything like that. I'm just going to go straight through, do the best I can at articulating the question and then answering it. But it's not going to have a bunch of fancy editing and titles and everything like that, because I'm just not able to do that right now. So one of the reasons that I created this video was because my sister Holly passed on just this absolutely stupendous and awesome question from a friend that she had. Um, and the question went something like this: wouldn't it Jesus's death have been more valuable if it had been more permanent? Put slightly differently, um, why doesn't the fact of Jesus' resurrection actually diminish the value of his death? And the basic idea here behind the question, and it's by the way just a really super excellent question, really excellent question. Um, but the idea behind the question is, isn't it true that some events or gifts, when they're done or given, uh, actually the value of that gift or that deed actually becomes more significant when it's permanent? And I think that's kind of the idea that sits underneath the question, is that it's appealing to, the question is appealing to a moral intuition, or a kind of intuition that we have, that there are events that can happen in the world that intensify uh, in relationship to their permanence, so that the more permanent they are, the more valuable they seem to be. And on this view, um, Jesus' resurrection seems to diminish the value or the intensity of his death, because he only stays dead for 3 days and then rises from the dead. And the question is basically, how is it that the resurrection of Jesus doesn't actually diminish the value or the significance of his death, given that he raises from the dead in the Christian tradition 3 days after he dies? Um, uh, One of the examples that I thought of that might illustrate this principle of how permanence kind of deepens value is, I recently saw this video where there was this gal talking about how the requirements that she had of her honey, if she was going to be bearing his kid. And one of her requirements was something like this. I might not have the story completely straight, but it's pretty close to the story. Her demand was this: um, the very experience of actually bearing children is going to do bearing your children is actually going to do permanent. It's going to have permanent effects on my body. And one of the ways that I want you to honor and signal the value of what I'm doing to my body in bearing children, um, is I want you to actually put a tattoo, a permanent tattoo of my face on your belly. Because, and the basic idea is, behind this demand is that because childbearing is actually going to have a permanent effect on my body, I want you to pay tribute to the significance of that gift by putting a permanent tattoo of my face on your own belly. And so that would be an example in everyday life of how a person might imply that the permanence of an event actually intensifies the worth of the act. Um, with that in mind, one of the things that I'd like to do is maybe outline maybe 4 or 5 pieces of meanings, if you will, that can actually say bridge the gap or answer the question, the really good question that was raised about Jesus's resurrection. How is it that the resurrection of Jesus doesn't diminish the value of his death, and that because Jesus was raised from the dead, it wasn't didn't seem to be like a permanent death. Um, so um, I think the first thing that I want to say um, uh, is that um, the value of an act's permanence will actually depend on the background story in which that act actually occurs. Um, let me unpack that a little bit further by kind of, I think, appealing to an intuition that both Christians and people in the skeptical tradition, even atheists, might actually share. And that intuition is this: as you look around the world, there's something about the world, about beauty and life itself that's really good. So, for example, if you just go outside and you look around at the world's beauty, um, there's we're actually just not looking at innate uh, dead objects. We're actually looking at things that are actually alive, and we have this intuition in the sense about the physical world out there, about plants and animals and trees and sunsets and so on and so forth, that we're actually encountering a kind and witnessing a kind of beauty that's actually good. And it's not just true of, say, things in nature; it's also true of people as well, and the fact that people are conscious and have consciousness and life. There's a recognition, a kind of intuition that we have in both traditions, the atheist and skeptical tradition, broadly speaking, and the Christian tradition, that what we're looking at and we're seeing, the beauty that we're witnessing, including life, is actually good. So that's the first major movement in my response, is that as we look at the world, there's kind of an intuition that the life and the beauty that we see is actually good. Um, the second thing I want to say is that let's just suppose, as a hypothetical example or question, um, that we wanted to work out what it would mean for God to actually be good, given the beauty and the life and the goodness of the beauty and life that we actually see. One of the questions that I have is a hypothetical right now. Could we imagine that one of the things that a good God might do is design his relationship to the world in such a way that death itself didn't get to render the final verdict about the meaning of the world's beauty, including its life? That is, when I say, can you imagine that a good God wouldn't allow death to render the final verdict about the goodness and the beauty of his own creation? What I mean is it possible that a good God could relate to the world's beauty and life uh, by such a way that he, um, in his relationship to the world, he in essence said, I'm going to relate to the world in such a way that although death is a feature that, say, penetrates into the world and a feature of human existence, I'm not going to allow death to actually have the final say about what happens to the goodness of my creation, or the life in my creation. Like, as a hypothetical, we could imagine, even if you're in a skeptical tradition, that hypothetically a good God might actually say that about the beauty in his world. I'm actually not going to let death have the final say about what happens to the beauty and the goodness of my own creation. So that's kind of the second um, uh, uh, piece of meaning that I'd like to bring up in responding to the question, that I think we both have an intuition as we contemplate the possibility of how a good God might be, that part of that goodness might be expressed in saying, hey, I'm not actually going to let death itself actually have the final say about the beauty, integrity, and goodness that actually occurs in my own creation. Um, there's all kinds of other questions that are raised with that. I'm going to skip by those right now and just keep focusing on the original question. How is it that the resurrection of Jesus, um, in the way that it makes his death not permanent, actually not diminish the value of his gift? The third thing that I want to mention is that is to point out a little another kind of intuition that many people in the atheist and skeptical tradition, one of the intuitions that they actually share with Christians. And I'm pointing this out because it's not often discussed. It's an intuition that travels through both of our experiences, but it's really rarely the case that this intuition is actually formally discussed. And uh, and the intuition is this. One of the reasons that um, we often chafe against death is because death seems to actually pull apart what seems to naturally belong together, or disintegrate what seems to naturally belong together. So, for example, when we're talking about the death of human beings, um, one of the things that actually happens in death that's so tragic is that a person's personality, um, and their consciousness, and the way that they see the world and interact with the world is actually pulled apart and severed from their own body in death. So that you could actually say that one of the things that makes death so miserable is that it takes two different kinds of beauty that seem to naturally belong together, and then it pulls them apart. In the case of physical death, it would be a person's kind of animating consciousness and experience of the world is actually pulled apart and severed from their body, so that while they seem to naturally belong together, death actually pulls them apart. That's an intuition that many in the skeptical or an atheistic tradition share with Christians, is that there is a sense in which they can understand how physical death actually pulls apart what seems to naturally belong together. Um, One of the things about the biblical or the Christian tradition, though, that's kind of an extra layer of meaning, that is about this idea of death being perverse because it disintegrates beauty, is that in the Christian or the biblical tradition, we also want to say that things that are immoral actually have the same disintegrating impulse to them, or seem to have the same disintegrating impulse. So, for example, if you simply laid out, sat down, if a Christian sat down with an atheist or an agnostic or a skeptic, and they just started cataloging different things that they both believed were immoral. So maybe not killing, we shouldn't kill people. We shouldn't murder people. I guess murder and killing are the same thing. Sorry, won't be editing that out. Lying, stealing, committing adultery, like cheating on your spouse, rape, sexual abuse, um, uh, uh, unjust wars. Those would be examples of kinds of activities that maybe people in the skeptical or atheistic tradition would actually share with Christians, in the sense that they'd have broadly overlapping moral intuitions, and that they would say these different things, doing these different things are wrong. But in the Christian and the biblical tradition, they're not just wrong. They're also a kind of an illustration of a death happening. So, for example, let me illustrate um, laws against stealing as a kind of death that's actually taking place. And when I say death in relationship to stealing, or kind of moral boundary that happens, I'm talking about, we have this intuition that there are kinds of beauty that are being pulled apart, two or more kinds of beauty in theft that are actually being pulled apart. So that while these beauties naturally belong together, theft actually pulls them apart. And it's this pulling apart that both makes it wrong, and in the Christian tradition at least, is a kind of death. So, for example, like with theft, one of the intuitions that we have about theft is that people actually work, in their work, they actually give away something that's of immense value to themselves, that is their own life, for somebody else. But they trade the giving away of their own life for a good reward for their labor, which often is money, like a paycheck, right? And so that the money that a person earns is actually a good reward that they actually get for their labor, because they actually give away something that's almost of infinite value to them, a portion of their life, for the sake of doing chores for somebody else or work for somebody else. And then they receive a good reward for their labor. So that we could say that a good reward for one's labor is a kind of beauty that actually exists in the world. And one of the things that theft does is it actually pulls apart a person, or disintegrates a person from the good reward of their labor, and then takes it and gives them nothing back in return, right? So there's a grief that we experience when we experience getting stolen from, or we see somebody else uh, uh, being stolen from. But that grief is actually over disintegrated beauty. We recognize that there are kinds of beauty that exist in a person's life, namely the person themselves, their work, the beauty and dignity of their own work, and then the reward of their labor, that is the money or the things that they buy with their money that actually belong to them. That you can see how just intuitively how theft actually pulls us apart. What's really interesting is kind of like a thought experiment is you can go around to every moral intuition that Christians and atheists broadly overlap with, and you can go around to each form of, say, badness, if you will, or things that we believe are morally wrong, and you can actually understand them as a pulling apart or a disintegrating of two or more kinds of beauty. They're actually being pulled apart in the event that we're describing as bad or that grieves us. Um, uh, so, um, one of the important things about this observation is this observation that death in the Christian tradition isn't merely physical death and people dying. It's also there's a way in which death actually disintegrates uh, uh, two or more kinds of beauty that are actually held together in the moral tradition, right? And so one of the things that's actually, I think, true is this is true both of Christians and atheists, is that every time you make a moral prescription to somebody else about what they should or shouldn't do, you're actually insisting that the person you're giving this command to has a moral obligation to stand in a subversive relationship to the tyranny of death, right? Because when you say you shouldn't steal something or you shouldn't kill, one of the things that you're telling the other person to do in the very fact of your command is you're telling them to stand in a subversive relationship to the tyranny of death, right? Because you're commanding them to relate to the beauties that they experience and witness in such a way that those beauties are actually held together and not pulled apart, right? And that's actually presupposed in most moral commands that I can think of, is that moral commands themselves and moral obligations presuppose that there are kinds of beauty that are being held together. And the purpose of the moral command is to actually get those beauties to stay held together and to not be pulled apart. And so one of the questions and tensions that emerges in the atheist and skeptical tradition is this. If we want to recognize that there is actually death-like dimensions that actually are bound up in doing what's wrong, one of the super important questions that almost never gets asked but has to be asked is this. Why in the world does a person have a moral obligation to subvert the tyranny of death by doing what's good, if the one who's ultimately responsible for our presence in the world can't even subvert the tyranny of death in his own experience? So let me say that again, because it's a mouthful, but it's a super important thing to pay attention to, especially as you're thinking about how intuitively and naturally we impose moral obligations on other people and say that they have a moral obligation to do things that are good. One of the questions that I have for the atheist and skeptical tradition is, what right do you have to tell someone to subvert the tyranny of death or stand in a subversive relationship to the tyranny of death by doing what's good, if the one who's ultimately responsible for our own presence in the world can't subvert death in his own experience? So that's kind of the third major movement in responding to this question about the permanence of Jesus's death, is that death isn't just something is tragic, not just because it's something that happens to physical people, but there are also moral dimensions to death that are really interesting, and they're intuitive, and we can actually see it when we just reflect on the moral prescriptions that we actually overlap and share with atheists. But that last question that I asked is, why does a person have a moral obligation to stand in a subversive relationship to the tyranny of death by doing what's good, if the one who's ultimately responsible for our presence in the world um, doesn't even have a subversive relationship to this tyranny of death, or can't subvert it in his own experience? And one of the reasons that I ask that is because as I listen to moral prescriptions just in the course of my life, one of the things that's like personally haunting for me is to experience these longings, to understand what other people are saying. But oftentimes in kind of American secular culture, there's often just tons and tons and tons and tons of moral prescriptions that are going on about what people are obligated to do. But it's really, 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 really rare for someone in my own public experience, in my experience of public life in America, for somebody to actually talk about a moral reality as a subversion of the tyranny of death, and then explore the question as to whether or not the one who's ultimately responsible for our presence in the world actually is capable of subverting death in his own experience. So this provides a really natural and a nice segue into the significance of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. One of the things that makes, in the Christian tradition, one of the things that makes Jesus such a unique figure in human history is that one of the things you'll realize as you watch his life, his death, and his resurrection is that everywhere Jesus was going, he was constantly subverting the tyranny of death. That is, if you understand kind of moral disintegration, or things that people do that are bad, or Christians actually call this sin, one of the things that you'll notice about or even evil, one of the things that you'll notice about things that are bad, evil, or whatnot, is how um, uh, evil and what's bad and everything like that is actually disintegrating, pulling apart different kinds of beauty. But one of the things that's super unique about Jesus, and you just watch his ministry in the gospel, is that everywhere he was going, he was constantly subverting the tyranny of death and the way that he related to other people. And just the course of his life, he was generous and kind where other people were harsh. He was appropriately critical and harsh, like towards, say, religious hypocrisy. As a matter of fact, some of the most when you look at Jesus's, where he starts getting hot under the collar and angry and really terse and direct with people, it's almost always or almost exclusively directed towards religious hypocrisy and arrogance and pride and so on and so forth. But there was, when you look at the way that he dealt with like social and religious outcasts, like say Zacchaeus, the tax collector, and various other people, adulterers and so on and so forth, there was a real gentleness that actually and patience that actually characterized his relationship to them. But as you just watch his life and you read it, he's constantly subverting the tyranny of death. And this actually is not just true in the life in the course of his life, but it's also true in his death as well. And that one of the reasons in the Christian tradition that Jesus's death is so important, and his resurrection, is that his resurrection is actually a kind of crowning capstone of a life that was spent subverting the tyranny of death. And one of the things that Jesus's death says in the Christian tradition is is that the tyranny of death actually will not reign, right? Um, so another thing that's actually being said in Jesus's incarnation as well is that in the incarnation, God himself is actually not standing aloof and apart from the human experience, but he's actually physically entering into it as a way of actually vindicating what he had originally claimed about his own good creation, right? Because at the beginning of the Bible, one of the things that God says, or one of the rhythms that God actually inhabits, is that he'll create, he'll survey what he created, and then he'll call it good. So he does this on each day. He'll create something, he'll survey what he made, and he'll celebrate it and call it good. And there's this idea in the Christian tradition and in the biblical tradition that God's creation is actually good. In the incarnation of Jesus, that is, when God actually becomes man and dwells among us, he's actually not just, say, entering into the human experience, he's actually vindicating his own creation as good. It's as though he's saying, my creation is so good, I'm actually willing to actually inhabit it. And this isn't anything that's weird in the incarnation of Jesus isn't really weird in the biblical story, because all the way from the beginning, you have God inhabiting his own creation in a way that seems to be really comfortable and natural. For example, in Genesis, it says God was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. He was doing that in the biblical tradition, because God was comfortable with the verdict that he'd actually rendered about his own creation, that his creation was good. And so the reason that Jesus's resurrection doesn't diminish the gravity and weight of his death is because in his resurrection, he's actually offering an embodied promise to the human race that says, death will not reign over my good creation. And he's actually authenticating that claim not merely by stating it, but by actually experiencing it in his own body, in his own existence, of fully squarely facing the tragedy of human malevolence, pride, and sin in his own crucifixion, in the way that they mocked him and spat on him and derided him, and so on and so forth. He's actually facing the full brunt of human evil and sin, squarely facing it. But he's actually turning it on, evil on its head, by subverting it at every place in his life, death, and resurrection. And so his resurrection doesn't diminish, in the Christian tradition, it doesn't diminish the gravity and weight and value of his death, because if he stayed dead to, say, affirm the value of his gift, or the intensity of what he had done, he would actually be conceding in his own embodied experience. God would actually be conceding the tyranny of death and implying to the rest of creation that death doesn't reign. And so, Christians actually don't believe that death reigns because of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Another thing that a reality that exists in the Christian tradition is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus wasn't just meant to be a good example. If it was, there's a kind of despair that doesn't really speak to the human condition, because there is a sense in which you could read Jesus's life, death, and resurrection as an example, and all that would be going on in that example is simply God proving to humanity that he can do what we can't do. But if Jesus is only doing that, that is only functioning as an example, the human plight is more deeper than just our need to see good examples. There's a real sense in which we actually need to participate with God in his triumph over the tyranny of death. And so that's actually what Jesus' ministry is actually designed, in his invitation to repentance and faith, and taking up our cross and following him. The purpose of that invitation is to invite, is for God to actually invite the people that he's made to participate with him in his triumph over the tyranny of death, so that everyone who actually comes to Jesus in repentance and faith doesn't just come face to face with a good example, but they actually, by being united to Christ, actually participate with him in his triumph over the tyranny of death. So that's I guess a good start for answering the question. I'm sure there might be follow-up questions that could definitely be asked. Certainly more exploring, because we just covered like a massive amounts of territory. But that's, I would say, an initial. That would be an initial answer to just a really, really great question about the value of Jesus's death. So that's it. Super great question. Thanks a million for asking it. Super grateful for my sister, Holly. She's super awesome. She admires you lots and lots as a good friend, and is so thankful for your friendship. But that's it. Have a good one.